my name is Curtis Collins. I'm going to be presenting today on the injury considerations in women's football. I'm from Melbourne in Australia, so when I talk about women's football, I'm talking about Australian rules football. So what is Australian rules football? I know a lot of you might not be familiar with the sport. So the AFL is the Australian Football League. The AFLW is the Australian Football League Women's, but it's the women's professional league in the country, and the sport itself, as I mentioned, is actually called Australian rules football, or it's commonly referred to as footy in Melbourne. So I own my own brand called C3 Fitness. I work with female and male footballers in the private sector. I was an assistant strength and conditioning coach with Hawthorn, who's a professional team in Australia. I worked with their women's team, and I currently am the head strength and conditioning coach with Collegians Football Club, which is a local club, and they have both men's and women's teams, and I work across both of them. So a lot of my experience as a young strength and conditioning coach has had to do with working with women's football, hence my interest in this presentation. I know a lot of you still probably aren't exactly sure what I'm talking about when I talk about the AFL, so I've got a short YouTube video here to give you a bit of an explanation of the game. The AFL made it a few years ago, I think specifically for the American market, so apologies for the dodgy accent, but here we go. So
this is awesome. It's not running. It's not kicking. It's got bone-on-bone hits without hands. No, it's not rugby. It's Australian football, although you might hear it called Aussie rules or even footy. This is Australia's biggest sport and is now played professionally by 18 teams in the AFL. It has the fourth highest average attendance of any domestic sports league in the world. These are some serious fans. What do you say we talk basics? Aussie rules is played on a football field, probably bigger than any you've ever seen, with an egg-shaped ball that takes some crazy bounces. Each team consists of 18 players on the field and 4 on the bench. Tremendous athletes, these players are basketball-sized with the hands and foot speed of an NFL wide receiver and stamina greater than a soccer player. The game starts with a center bounce, a bit like a basketball jump ball. The basic object of the game, like American football, is to move the ball down the field and score. What the way? 45! You can move the ball 3 ways. Running, but you have to bounce it every 16 yards. Using your fist to hit it forward. This is called a handball, another skill unique to Aussie rules.
Nice running. Ellis was involved as well. First time started it all. Drills it home.
And of course, the most common way is kicking it.
Oh, it's called God.
Like a quarterback using feet instead of hands, these guys can hit a teammate on the run at 50 yards. If the kick is a little high, a player may have to jump and make a spectacular catch. This is called a mark. And believe it or not, you can use the opponent as a springboard for jumping. If you take a mark, you can keep going, or you can stop on the spot and take an unimpeded kick.
Glorious kick!
Once in scoring position, the idea is to kick the ball through the 2 large upright posts. That's a goal and worth 6 points.
Yes, left foot, well within his repertoire.
If you hit the post, or send it between the big post and the outer lower post, it's worth 1 point and is called a behind.
All right, so I hope that gives you a little bit of context around the game that I'm talking about. As you can already pick up, there's quite a lot going on in the sport, so there's a fair bit to consider in terms of the physiological demands of the game, in terms of the injury considerations, the movement patterns. So that was obviously all AFL, which is the Australian Football League, the men's game. That itself, some of the founding teams of the AFL were formed in 1858 and 1859. So the men's game is extremely old, but the women's game, the professional league, was only founded in 2017. So it's obviously a much younger sport, and there's a lot of scope for sort of research in the field, and also figuring out how to best go about injury prevention methods, and working on tactics that are still being developed throughout the sport. So obviously there's a few differences here. The AFLW has 15-minute quarters. They only have 16 players in the field, and they have 6 players on the bench. So already you can see that that's going to cause a few differences compared to the males game, the men's game. So they're very similar in senses, but they're also very different in senses. So as I mentioned, the AFLW was only developed in 2017. So there's a lot of growth at the moment. This is data from 2018. There's more than 500,000 women that play the game around the world. There's a massive increase in female teams across the country. There were 4 new teams in the AFL last year, and there's 2 more to come. So you can see that there's a lot of room for growth, but with that growth means that there's a lot of fresh young players that might not necessarily be developed for the game and for the rigors of the game. So that's one of the things I'm going to be touching on. This is the 2018 AFLW injury report. The data is listed in injury incidents per 1,000 hours, so that we can compare it to the men's game. So it gives us some comparable data. Some of the interesting figures that straight away jump out, you can see that concussion rates are considerably higher in the women's game than compared to the men's game. Another major one is that hamstring injury incidences are considerably higher for the men's game. It's their most injurious, I guess. One of the thoughts behind that is potentially that the women in the game don't get exposed to the same volume or speed of sprinting, which is a risk factor for soft tissue hamstring injuries. In the men's game, there's quite a high volume of high speed running, as well as a high volume of running overall. So in the AFL, some of the elite runners cover about 15 to 16 kilometers in a game, and in the women's game it's more like 10 to 11. So there's a difference in volume, but also in overall sprint volume as well. And then another one that jumps out immediately is the injury incidence for ACLs for women. It's considerably higher in the AFLW than it is in the AFL, and the 2020 data obviously isn't there because the season it's just happened, and it also sort of got cancelled towards the end because of COVID. But they had done something like 16 ACLs so far, and the season hadn't even finished. So that actually would have put this figure even higher. The other thing you can tell overall is that men in the AFL actually get injured more than women do in the game. But there are, as I mentioned, these few areas for concern. So yeah, I've got those covered here. But moving on to talking about the ACL specifically, it's a band of connective tissue that attaches to the medial aspect of the lateral femoral condyle, and it inserts anteriorly to the intercondyloid eminence of the tibia, which you can see down here. Its function is to resist anterior tibial translation and rotational loads. So Because of this, common movements that cause injury to the ACL, as I'm sure you're all aware, is pivoting, changing of direction, accelerating, decelerating, jumping, landing, things of that nature. So here's a brief, one of the main injuries.
That never looks good when there's no contact and you just change directions, as we see here. Left knee.
So it's a pretty dire looking injury. I've been involved on the sidelines in games where I've seen two girls have non-contact ACL injuries within minutes of each other. So it's certainly something we don't like to see in the sport, but it unfortunately happens, which is why we want to talk about how we can potentially reduce these chances. But it's not just the AFLW in comparison to the AFL that has higher rates. Here's some NCAA data collected covering a variety of sports, but I've included men's and women's basketball, men's and women's lacrosse, and men's and women's soccer. And you can see across the board that the incidence is higher for the women compared to the men. So it's not just an issue for AFLW, it's an issue for women's sport around the world. But why does it happen? What are we looking to, how are we looking to alter the risk factors for ACL injuries? So there's external risk factors to consider, like the playing surface, the weather, how the weather actually interacts with the playing surface. And then there's also even external factors like, is it a game versus practice? So it's known that there's a higher injury risk or there's a high instance of ACL injuries during games and versus practices. That sort of makes sense because players are going harder. But what we're going to be focusing on today more so are the intrinsic risk factors for women, which is anatomy, physiology, biomechanics, and neuromuscular control. As a strength and conditioning coach, we're looking at trying to work on the modifiable risk factors. Obviously, there's no point trying to butt your head against the wall with the non-modifiable risk factors, but I'm going to touch on anatomy here. So women generally have smaller and different shaped intercondylar notches. So the gap here, this is at the bottom of the femur, the gap here where the ACL transitions through is actually smaller for women than compared to men. So there's not as much freedom of movement there. And then women also have a larger Q angle, which is the angle, if you draw a line from the kneecap to the ASIS of the pelvis. So the line of pull of the quadriceps muscles isn't as efficient as at creating motion or stability at the knee joint as is for men. And this is just because biologically women are designed to bear children. So they have naturally wider pelvises. So that's a non-modifiable risk factor that puts them slightly at more risk of having a knee injury, but specifically ACLs. Physiologically, women have periods, men don't. The science is still not rock solid on this, but there's evidence to suggest that during the follicular stage of the menstrual cycle that estradiol has a relaxation effect on the ACL tissue. So there's a slight relaxation of the knee joint, and with that slight change in laxity, there's also minimal changes in muscle contraction, firing patterns. So the quadriceps and the hamstrings don't quite fire the way they do at other times of the cycle, and that's been found to have a slight increase in chances of ACL injury during athletic type movements, so cutting and jumping and landing. It's worth noting that Chelsea Football Club in the English Premier League and also then Brisbane Football Club in the AFL, they measure the female players' menstrual cycle data just like any sort of player wellness management data. It's just another piece of information that they collect and they base training off that. So it's certainly gaining some steam around the world, but the jury's out on it still. So just something to note. Biomechanically, I briefly touched on the type of movements that can put the ACL at risk earlier in the presentation. As you saw in the video, that a movement where the foot starts to pronate, there's a dynamic cutting type movement, the knee drops into dynamic valgus. It's the sort of thing that really puts the ACL at risk, and I think it goes hand in hand with neuromuscular control. So obviously the more control you have over the joint, the less likely you are to dive into those sort of poor positions. I mean, this could be something I'll look into with the Franz Bosch research I just heard from Peter before. I feel like this would have some positive effects here. But there's some research to suggest that in studying the landing mechanisms of female and male dancers, ballet dancers, they found that their landing mechanics were really similar. And the reason thought to be behind that was because female and male dancers train sort of equivalent amounts right the way through their athletic development, where in a sport like AFLW, as I mentioned, it's only 4 years old, the Premier League. A lot of young girls just don't have that the same length of time in the system, training for the sport specifically, or also having that time in the gym or even out in the field learning cutting mechanics or jumping or landing mechanics. So in a sport like dancing, where they do have equivalent amounts of training from a really young age, the landing mechanics, the differences between men and women were basically none. And female dancers displayed really low injury rates in terms of those high-risk movements. Whereas when they compared the landing mechanics to male field athletes had pretty good mechanics in comparison as well, but then female field athletes were the ones that showed really risky landing strategies. So I feel like there's something to be said for that in terms of long-term youth athletic development, and also just being part of a really well-structured strength and conditioning program. So this is where the practical applications come in somewhat. I mentioned those two factors. There's also, there's potential to look into the timing of training loads based off of the menstrual cycle data, but that's not something I'm going to go too much further into. But something I do know a lot about is a well-structured strength and conditioning program. So we want to make sure, this is for the female AFLW athlete, but it goes out to any athlete. Really, we want to make sure that the program is balanced. We're addressing all muscles of the body. We're trying to teach perfect technique, which leads back to the biomechanics side of this. We want to be able to train our athletes out of poor movement patterns. We want to make sure that our prescription is lifting age appropriate. So when I worked with Hawthorn, we had a lot of capable athletes, but they might have been 24 or 25 years old and they'd never lifted a weight in a gym. So just because they were a semi-elite or elite level athlete